Welcome to the Seminole Wars. In this podcast, we explore how the Seminole Wars came to be, how they were fought, and how they still resonate some 2 centuries later. I am your host, Patrick Swan, and our show is a production of the Seminole Wars Foundation, found online at www.seminolewars.us. We are recording today from the homestead of the Foundation in Bushnell, Florida. Thank you for listening. Hello and welcome. One of the reasons this podcast exists is to explore the enduring effects of the Seminole Wars on Florida and the USA. Pedro Zepeda is a direct descendant of the Seminole who fought in that war and withdrew to survive and later thrive in the Everglades. He has been the face of the Seminole as a narrator for the annual reenactment of the Dade Battle in Bushnell each January. He speaks from the heart to inform visitors that the Seminole fought for their livelihoods, their families, and their homes so they could stay in Florida. Pedro Zepeda, welcome to the Seminole Wars.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it. I'm looking forward to our conversation today.
How do the Seminole Wars still resonate among Florida Seminole today?
We had basically a 40-year conflict with the United States government and an entire lifetime, and so, that definitely resonates through the generations quite easily through stories being handed down. And just like for my grandmother, she grew up with some of the people that were alive at the end of those conflicts, so she knew those people directly that saw what war was like and knew what it was like to run and hide and fight. And so just having someone that has that direct connection to those wars affects a whole generation.
What did you learn growing up about the tribe, about the Seminole Wars?
Oh boy, just a lot of different things, really. The military structure is something that is built into the culture of our tribe through our matriarchal clan system, through naming of our children. There is a high degree of organization that was present long before Europeans set foot on this continent. That structure has always been there. Came time for war, it was easy to fall into the positions that was needed to go to battle. Things like training of warriors and leaders and things like that were done through hereditary matriarchal title, things like that. And so some of that stuff, we hear in stories of the different leaders, and sometimes the stories are a little different than what we hear in the history books as far as what happened to some of these different leaders and the role that they played, and what they did and how important what they did was for us today. Because obviously, Seminole Tribe of Florida wouldn't be here in Florida if it weren't for my ancestors that fought in those wars and fought so hard for so long for us to have the right to be here.
Pedro, are you at liberty to say any of those stories about leaders that are different from what we hear outside of the Seminole circle?
We still practice our traditional medicine today, so it's always played a big part of all parts of our lives, including warfare. For us, like the escape from the Castillo de San Marcos and San Augustine, in our stories we use different types of medicines to be able to escape from that fort. Of course, I've heard different stories from different tribal members about how that escape actually happened. From being able to do certain medicines that allowed us to fit through the window to stories that made guards pass out so that we were simply able to walk out of the fort. So again, I've heard different things as far as, how that exactly happened, but medicine always plays a big part of that. A lot of times the stories I hear about some of the leaders is that they were assassinated before they left, things like that as well. So it's slight differences, oral histories handed down. And so, sometimes, the oral histories don't always match up from one family to another.
What have you learned through your own study in the years since about the Seminole Wars and your people in it?
So, of course, there's that cultural aspect. And I've also learned quite a bit through participating in living history for, 23 years now, I believe. I've been doing living history, and so, I've learned quite a bit doing that as well from other living history people and historians, and trying to match up what I learned that way with learned, again, from speaking with different tribal members and different tribal elders, and kind of trying to match all that up and try to create a more complete story, a more complete history as far as what happened during the wars. Learning, studying, and being with other living history people, just learning the specific battles and, how many soldiers were there and things like that. One thing I learned is that the military side seemed to always lose a lot more in battle than the Seminoles did. I think a lot of that just had to do with the different fighting tactics that, were being carried out between Seminoles and the U.S. military.
Right. So some of us who study the U.S. Army and the soldier employment wonder, What were the secrets that the Seminoles have? Could they tell us what were they doing? What were they thinking? Anything like that is passed down either through the oral histories or through your own study that you can reveal to us?
Clan, family, culture, medicine is always like central to everything. And so we would, partake in special medicines before and upon returning from battle and going to war. The medicine people were also leaders as well. So we did have actual organized training for different levels of our military force, whether it was a ground soldier or one of the commanding leaders that, they had special training. Again, this was dependent upon what their clan was and what their family was. And, so learning those tactics definitely helped. Again, one of it's just a big different fighting style. Seminoles, we were participating in now known as guerrilla-style warfare, where we weren't participating in the traditional European style of standing in lines and formations in front of another group and just shoot at each other until, one group has a few people standing at the end of the day. We're using the natural terrain and trees and things like that to our advantage, using the environment of Florida or wherever we're at to be advantageous in the fight and having a plan. We were always trying to choose the battlefield and choose the time and choose the techniques for our engagements with U.S. military. If we weren't in the position to make that choice, usually we would not engage for very long before we, disengage in the fight, because then it's more advantageous if you know what your plan is going into the battle. So these large engagements like, Battle of Okeechobee, Dade Battle, we knew what we were doing and we had a plan and try and execute that plan to the best of our ability.
Pedro, tell me about the clans, because you just mentioned there. Would the clans be mixed in a battle, or would there be clans side by side? This number of this clan, this number of that clan, ready for a battle?
And so, today we have 7 clans that we still have here in Florida. The Seminole clan system it's a matriarchal system, so it's a fancy way of saying that it's passed down through the mother's side. So, in traditional European Western culture, the family lineage is kept track of through the father, usually by adopting the father's last name. But in most Native North American cultures, we keep track of a family through the mother by adopting your mother's clan. And so, I'm Panther Clan, for example, because my mother is Panther Clan, because her mother is Panther Clan, because her mother was Panther Clan, going, what we say, all the way back to the beginning of time. And so it's a really big and strong part of the culture is the clan system and its importance to facilitate education, ceremony, just general raising and rearing of children, and warfare as well. So when you would go into battle, you would go with your clan, with your family. And so it's kind of, I guess the best analogy would be like going in as platoons. And so you'd go with your clan, and so you'd have ways of keeping track of your clan or your platoon when you go out to battle, so it would be less confusing. Again, every military has to have some sort of organization on the battlefield to try and cut down on confusion while you're in the midst of fighting. So we had different ways of trying to keep track of your fighting unit.
You said you're 23 years or so going to battle reenactments?
Yeah, I was 14 years old when I started doing living history, and I'm 37 now.
And what was the first reenactment that you went to, or the living history that you went to?
It was one that my older brother Brian had actually helped organize at the Collier County Museum here in Naples. And, he got started in living history a little bit before I did. And, the reason I did was because my older brother was doing it. It looked really cool, looked really fun. And so I started doing it with him. And so he started out at another event at the same museum here in Collier County. They did something called the Old Florida Festival, which is like a timeline event. And so he started participating in that, and then he organized Battle or Billy Bull Leg Battle or something like that. I'm trying to remember the exact name of the event. And I think he did it 2 years. And so that's when I started participating in doing the reenactments. And then, he started going to things like Dade Battle, and I'd go with him. And then in 1997, the Atophagy Museum opened up. And so once he started working there, the director of the museum, Billy Cypress at the time, he asked my brother if he could organize a battle reenactment. And so they started the Kissimmee Slough Shootout, because on the Big Cypress Reservation, we have the Kissimmee Slough. So not to be confused with Kissimmee, Florida, it's Central Florida. So that reenactment went on for a number of years at the museum, and then eventually got moved over to Billy Swamp Safari. So I participated in that event about every year. I think there was only 1 year I didn't go because of a family event. So a lot of the reason I was doing living history is because of what my older brother was doing. But, as I grew up and became an adult and, started participating in these events. And so I was able to drive. I could drive to some of these events on my own as well. Pretty neat, and made some lasting, lifelong friends through doing this as well.
How long have you been going to the annual Dade Battle reenactment?
Gosh, I think I did that maybe the first or second year I started doing living history, so I was probably 14 or 15 years old. So it's probably somewhere around like 97 or something like that.
How has it changed? Now, I don't mean the battle. We know how the battle goes. But the reception for Seminole from the people who are visiting.
I mean, I think the public has always enjoyed the event. So I mentioned Billy Cypress, who was the director of the Asasagi Museum, helped found and create the tribe's museum. And so for a number of years, he did the narration at the battle. Because the Dade Battle, they have a person portraying Ransom Clark, and then they have a Seminole portraying Jumper. And so Billy Cypress portrayed that role for a number of years, till his unfortunate passing. And then the position remained vacant for a long time. I think my brother Brian, I think he did it maybe 2 or 3 years, possibly more, I can't remember. So he did it for a few years as well. And there was a number of years where nobody was doing the narration. And so I think it was about maybe 6 years ago, something like that, maybe 7, that I decided to go ahead and start doing the narration at the Dade Battle. They'd been asking me for a while, but about 6 or 7 years ago, I finally decided to go ahead and do the narration. One of my big hesitations is I always like just being out in the battlefield and participating in the actual battle reenactment, but I really do enjoy doing the narration now as well. And so as far as the public reception, I think they've really pretty much always enjoyed it. I think they enjoy hearing the two sides to the battle, hearing the fight of the soldiers and the tenacity of the Seminoles. And so I think having both elements there really, I think it adds to the story and to people's enjoyment and interpretation of the event and the actual going-ons of what happened there.
When you speak, you talk about motivations for the Seminole. What do you want our listeners today to take away from the Seminole at the Dade Battle specifically, and from the resistance to removal in general?
Gosh, that's a big question. I really always want people to know is that, Seminoles are still here. We're still here in Florida, that we're, still practicing our culture, still practicing our language, still practicing, our traditional religion. And all that is because of the fighting of our ancestors. And it's something that is changing now than from when I was younger, as people are starting to realize that Native Americans are still existing, that we're not just in history books, that we don't just exist in the past. And that's why I work really hard at trying to convey to people that we are still here, because it is kind of a habit that a lot of people don't know they have, is speaking of Native Americans in past tense. And, I see that a lot when I'm at an event, even when I'm, not doing a living history event. If I'm doing some sort of a cultural talk or demonstration, there'll be that tendency to say, oh yeah, what did the Indians do? Or what did they say? Or what did they? It's like, well, I can tell you what we do, what we do say, what we do feel, what we do believe, so I do really like trying to connect that, here's what happened in our past, here's what happened in our history, but it's also important to know that we're still here and we're still making history and still, evolving as a tribe and as a people.
How do you feel about reenactors who are not Seminole, who play the Seminole part at reenactments? I understand sometimes they do it because there's no Seminole available to come out.
As far as, the reenactors that portray Seminoles, there are very few that actually are members of the Seminole Tribe of Florida. Really just a handful of us that participate in the battle reenactments. The rest, some of them do, know that they have a Creek or Seminole ancestry, in their history. It's just a lot of times it's a few generations back or not enough to be enrolled with the federally recognized Seminole or Miccosukee tribes of Florida. But a lot of them got their interest because they, did digging in their family histories and found out, oh, hey, look, I had a distant relative, or, sometimes only maybe 3 or 4 generations back that was Creek or Seminole, or started their interest in learning the history of the tribe. And I know there's quite a few that got their start also through the Order of the Arrow and the Boy Scouts. And so they started learning about the culture of Seminole tribe through that. Although they're not members of the tribe, a lot of times they are speaking to the public. For the most part, are very upfront and honest about not being an actual member of the Seminole tribe, but they, have learned a lot about the history, and that's where their love is, learning the history and, conveying that little known history to whoever they can. And I know personally I've learned quite a bit from these other non-Seminole reenactors. I've been able to add to their knowledge as well. I hope it's a mutual a trade there.
What can you do to encourage more Seminole to participate in these reenactments?
We've had a few over the years that have, participated. Some that have participated a couple times and haven't, or come and go. And there's been a few that have started and really stuck with it. So just like anything, I can't force anybody to want to do something. Every person's an individual, and so they have their different interests and passions. And so for some people it is the history, and sometimes that there's different ways of conveying our history too, whether it's through living history or lecturing or working at a museum or, preserving, the oral histories of the tribes. So there's a lot of different ways of helping preserve our history and teaching about our culture, including conflict of the Seminole Wars. So if there are Seminoles that do want to participate, we always try to facilitate them, or really anyone that wants to learn more about the history and the hobby of reenacting in general. That's
a nice segue, because I've heard you say you've spent your whole life trying to preserve and sustain Seminole culture and materials.
So, I did spend a lot of time with my maternal grandmother, my mom's mom, growing up. That's the Seminole side. My father is Tejano. He's not Seminole, but he's Texas-born Mexican. And so there's, European and Native history down that line as well. But being here in Florida and being the matrilineal culture it is, I spent a lot of time with my maternal grandmother. And, it's not just my grandma, my great-grandma, and my great-great-aunt as well. And so spent a lot of time around them. I was very young. They only spoke in Seminole to each other. They didn't speak English to each other at all.
You speak English, so there can be a certain assimilation, and then there can be loss of the language and the culture that goes with the language.
Yeah, exactly. So, as I was saying, I took some of that in, but I don't speak the language fluently. I wish I really did growing up, and so that I was able to learn it. But, I do spend time, as an adult trying to pick up more of it. Obviously learning any language can be difficult, whether it's English, Spanish, or Native North American language. It definitely can be difficult to learn.
Because you said you spent your whole life trying to preserve and sustain Seminole culture and materials. You mentioned a little bit earlier how people talk about Indians and maybe Seminole in the past tense, and you have to remind them that the Seminoles and Indians in general in America are still with us.
Yeah, so in the culture growing up, it wasn't like I wasn't just Seminole on the weekends or when there was a powwow or ceremony or something like that. It was a day-to-day thing, hearing the culture, being immersed in it. It's really great, when, people learn about their Native ancestry and things like that. There's nothing wrong with it. Just for me, it was just a part of the daily life, and I was really fortunate to, have that experience, to be able to immerse in that culture day to day. Started doing the living history when I was 14 years old. It wasn't long after that my brother Brian, who I mentioned, when he started working at the Dade Museum, so the tribe's museum that was soon to be open. And so I was able to go to the museum and see the artifacts and see some of the oral histories and see some of the stories people would bring in, and the research that was being done to create the clothing and the text for the museum, and be around a lot of people that had a passion for Seminole history and culture, past and present. So that kind of started my relationship with our own museum, when I was 14, and just going with my brother and hanging out while he was helping build the displays in the museum, and getting more information and trying to learn more about some of the different artifacts and objects and texts that was in the collections of the museum. And sometimes they would hire me for like VIP events before the museum opened. They'd give private tours of the museum to local city and county commissioners and things like that. Because I was already pretty well into living history pretty early on. Really just kind of immersed in a lot of that. And I've always been artistic as well. Drawing and coloring and a lot of doodling growing up and crafting and creating. And so trying to learn a lot more about the material culture was a pretty natural segue for myself. Especially, my grandmother sewed our patchwork clothing as a living, so she was always sewing all the time, all day. She'd only stop to cook us dinner and lunch and things like that. And because, my grandma would live with us part-time. She'd have her own place, but she lived with us part-time as well. And So she was always sewing, and so I was always around that material culture as well. And so it got me interested in learning some of the older material culture, things about, things like finger weaving and beadwork and, some of the older clothing styles and things like that. And it's surprising how much my grandma knew about those older clothing styles, even though she didn't sew it herself, being separated from clothing that had been used by that point, probably about 70 or 80 years, and she still knew about them and how to cut and construct some of those clothing. So I thought that was kind of interesting.
Tell us about the art you create and how you integrate the Seminole culture into your painting, your ceramics, your canoes.
So, yeah, for the canoes, it's really pretty simple, just because the canoes are a part of our culture. They're part of our history. We've always made them. We've never not made canoes, and we continue to make them today. As far as my personal art, as far as like painting and sculpting, drawing, I don't know, it's just always seemed natural to include some part of that Seminole heritage into it. And so, like, my sculptures would be pretty stylized human forms, but a lot of them would still, kind of harken back to some sort of Seminole imagery or clothing style or something along those lines. Unless we're looking for it, you might not necessarily know that it's there, but it definitely is included in a lot of my art. I can't say necessarily every single piece that I've done has a very direct Seminole traditional imagery in it, but just having that passion for the Seminole Wars, too. I've done, paintings and drawings, depicting that time, and, I've always depicted it from the Seminole side as well. What was the war like from our point of view? What did it look like hiding in the woods? What did it look like hiding in the swamps? What did it look like as we went about our days? Some of that more realistic imagery was geared definitely towards the wars and how it looked like from our vantage point. Now, that being said, I haven't really done a lot of that drawing and painting and sculpting in quite a number of years. I have focused a lot on our traditional arts in probably the last 10, 12 years. So, like our traditional woven baskets and wood carving and canoes and leatherwork and things like that, and trying to maintain those and in some cases revive some of those arts or rekindle them. Like, for example, as I mentioned, we've always made canoes. We've never stopped making them. But in the last 40, 50 years, we haven't hardly, really had a need to use them in our day-to-day lives. So with that, there's been fewer and fewer canoe carvers and less refinement on those canoes being carved. And so for me, I've been trying to learn about carving canoes, but also trying to maintain the refinement of those canoes from when they were being used in our day-to-day lives, when we needed to use them, when we had to use them to get from one place to another. And, I don't necessarily have a master canoe carver over me saying, oh, yeah, you need to, carve a little more here or shape this just like this, or, if you do it this way, the canoe will work like this. And since I don't really have that master canoe carver, learn from other carvers, but not necessarily a canoe carver. And so I've used measurement and drawings and photos of some of our canoes from when we were using them every day to know, okay, when we're using them, the canoe pole was about this thick, it was about this wide, it was about that long. And so I can apply that to the canoes that I'm carving to make sure I'm, not losing that refinement that we've, been building over, hundreds and thousands of years.
How do you see this as helping sustain Seminole culture and materials for future generations?
In our traditional art, it might be different than other cultures, maybe not. There's a whole lot of cultural knowledge that goes along with our traditional arts, from stories, specific language and words, and what I call cultural etiquette as well that goes along with making things. So cultural etiquette is kind of like the rules and regulations of a tradition and a culture. Who can make something, when can they make it, what materials can they use, what time of the year can they do it, when can they collect these, when can they not collect something. And a lot of that stuff has its own stories as well. And so if you lose a traditional art, you're losing all that cultural knowledge that went along with it. So it's not merely just making a basket or, making a piece of beadwork or just carving a canoe. There's a whole lot of other knowledge that goes along with it that get lost if those traditions are not maintained. And, it's just, at least for me, I feel personally, it's just really important to learn how to use your hands and to make something, whether it's something as complex as a dugout canoe or learning some other type of craft or hobby, it's kind of therapeutic for all of us as well to learn to make something. And I think there's something to that in cultures that, indigenous cultures around the world, like as a pastime, people make stuff, and it's, a place to share with family, to share stories, and just to share time with one another as well.
Pedro, what's your favorite piece that you've made over the years?
Oh, geez, my favorite thing. wasn't expecting this question.
How about some items that would be in your top 5?
Yeah, well, I mean, I definitely, I love canoes a lot, dugout canoes, and so one of the ones I'm working on now, it's almost complete, it's just, I really, love the shape and the form and how it's really coming along, and so, yeah, I do really love shape and form and how, they fit together and make something look kind of graceful and beautiful. I think that's why I leaned a lot towards sculpture, too, when I was in school and really playing with the shape and form. And so, I was making these large sculptures, 3 or 4 foot tall ceramic sculptures. And so, yeah, there's one that I have. It's kind of representative of a warrior, but again, it's very stylized of a Seminole warrior, and I think it's probably one of my favorite sculptures. And, the body is really just kind of a simple tube, and then it flares out to kind of these broad shoulders, and, the head is really stylized, and to kind of replicate face paint, I cut away the parts of the face that would be painted, and the other half has kind of a stylized eye on it and has something representative of a turban. But again, unless you're like really familiar with the imagery or what I was trying to accomplish, you might not know that that's exactly what it was representing, but always trying to keep form and grace in my mind when I was creating these sculptures. So it's probably one of my favorite sculptures.
How about a painting?
Paintings, probably the thing I like doing the least is painting. And I don't know why. I think just sitting in front of the easel is just hard for me, but like sculpture and carving, you're kind of, up and moving around a lot more. With the painting, it was a little more static. But I did do some painting as part of class projects in high school and college. I did do one that was kind of a satire. It's these 2 Seminole hunters walking through the woods, and they're carrying a pole between them, as you would carry a deer or other animal through the woods back to camp, except hanging from the pole is a slot machine. So I called that artwork Bringing Home the Game. So just kind of a mixture of traditional and contemporary Seminole worlds, and how we're still might be hunting, but it might be a different kind of hunting now to make ends meet.
This is a twofold question. How do you feel about Seminole artifacts or purported and really fake or phony Seminole artifacts being sold on auction sites like eBay?
Anything that's listed as Native American, you really have to look at very closely to see if it's an actual native-made item, whether it's contemporary or historic. It doesn't matter. There's a lot of forgeries or even just mislabeled, again, for historic items and ancient items and modern native artwork. It happens a lot because it's a big business. So much so that the United States passed the Indian Arts and Crafts Act to try and prevent people from doing this. And, so if you see something for sale on whether it's, eBay, or even if it's a really reputable auction house like Christie's or something like that, really do the research and see if it matches up with what's already existing in museums and collections or what other experts are saying. Because again, I've been studying our material culture, not just in my adult life, but even through my teen years. And I see a lot of things that are labeled as Seminole or as other tribal affiliations that simply are not, especially on eBay. It doesn't mean that there aren't Seminole items like, baskets and things that get sold on there, but there's a lot of non-Seminole items. Like sometimes it's just like, it's a coiled basket. I've seen that Seminoles make coiled baskets, so it must be a Seminole basket. Oh, not necessarily. Or, I bought this in Florida. It has to be Seminole. Well, not necessarily. There's all these tourist traps for selling stuff from around the world, even in the early tourism days of Florida, alongside the, genuine Seminole-made items. So you just got to be really careful, really cautious, be a cautious buyer, or even if you're doing research as well. I know, another conversation, is talking about how even museums can mislabel things, because I've seen museums with mislabeled Seminole items, because again, museums do the best job that they can, intentionally trying to dupe the public, but staff isn't always necessarily an expert on everything that's in a museum, especially if it's just like a general history museum or general Florida history. They're not necessarily a Seminole material culture expert, so they'll do the best job they can at identifying. Now that our museum has been around for a number of years, a lot of times other museums will consult with our tribal museum to say, hey, does this look right, or is our text right, or are we identifying things correctly, or in a culturally sensitive type way, or are we being entertaining, informative, so that's the great part of having our own tribal museum is having people coordinate with us to make sure that correct history and story is being presented to the public when it can be.
What's your relationship with the museum?
Current time, I'm a village crafter. So, I worked in the tribe's living village and do wood carving back there. But I've worked in a number of positions while I've been at the museum. Again, like when I was a teenager, I might just get hired for a specific event to, give tours to people if they knew they're having, influx of visitors or VIPs or something along those lines. When I was in college, during the summers, I'd work as a tour guide over the summertime. And then as an adult, my first job there was as oral history coordinator. So just, trying to manage the oral history collections that were already there and trying to collect new oral history. And then probably what I did the longest was a position they created was called the traditional arts coordinator, which is great. It really allowed me to kind of hone and refine and research our traditional arts. And I was also able to better educate the public on the traditional arts and material culture of Seminole people. So I was doing talks and lectures. I was giving demonstrations, and I was doing classes with tribal members that wanted to learn about different traditional arts. So I did that for a number of years, and I really loved doing that. And then other job I had there was outreach and outreach coordinator. So basically just the person sending the outreach staff out to schools and other civic groups and things that wanted to learn something about Seminole culture or history. Doing a lot of the traditional arts really helped that, and helping other staff with their presentations that they were giving as they went out to the public. And so, we had, at that time, it was an all native staff of outreach. And they weren't all Seminole, but they're all native. And, they definitely had a passion for the history and culture. So, I've had a long relationship with our museum, from being a coordinator to being a tour guide while I was off summer during college.
We're almost out of time. I want to ask one closing question. What would you want listeners to take away from our conversation today about Seminole Wars and specifically, and about the Seminole in general?
So for the Seminoles, the Seminole Wars was one long conflict. We didn't have the luxury of leaving Florida when our tour of duty was over, to leave the fight, to leave the strain of always possibly being removed, the threat of being killed, the threat of being hunted. And for 40 years, we endured that as a people. Part of the reason much of that sticks with us today, but we did endure it, and I think what's really important is that we're still here. And we've managed to keep our culture through all of that, through the literal genocide and cultural genocide, trying to get rid of the people. Well, if you can't get rid of the people, and try and get rid of the culture. And so we've managed to survive both of those things. And, hopefully we'll continue to survive through the coming years and through the next generations. And I think that's really what I'd like people to know about Seminoles and where we are and where we were.
Pedro Zepeda, thank you so much for joining us today on the Seminole Wars.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
If you enjoyed this show, please take a moment to like us on Facebook at Seminole Wars Foundation. Leave a review on iTunes or your favorite podcast provider. Your reviews and comments help new listeners discover us and help us keep the show going. Visit our website at www.seminolewars.us for blogs, articles, news, books, events, membership information, and how to subscribe to this podcast. We'll be back soon with a new episode of the Seminole Wars Podcast. The Seminole Wars Foundation is a 501c3 nonprofit organization dedicated to preservation, education, and publication of Seminole Wars history throughout the state of Florida. This podcast is copyrighted the Seminole Wars Podcast 2020, all rights reserved. Front bumper music, The Devil's Garden, Roast 'em, provided by kind permission of Reedy Youngman. Back bumper music, Second Seminole Win, by Jed Merrim and Ricky Pittman, courtesy of Ricky Pittman, all rights reserved.